So I think we should get started, even though we may expect a couple of more people, but the time is there. So it's a pleasure for me, as every Tuesday, to welcome you to the MF CASR lunch in the library. And it's a particularly great honor to introduce today's speaker, Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay, Associate Professor at ICOS, right?
Yeah.
Yes, welcome. It's good to have you here. So Bodhi will present the work that is going on in the various CoFuture project or the CoFuture project. You have to explain this. And I must say that this is one of the most exciting research projects out there, in my view. So I really look forward to hearing about it. So we'll do what we always do at the MF CASR lunch. We'll let Bodhi speak for 13 minutes. Sharp. And then we have like 30 minutes for question and answers. And you can use the microphone that is over there if you want to ask questions, if you're in the audience here, or if you are following us on Zoom, you can use the chat function and Esther will read the questions for us. Bodhi, please.
Thank you, Liv. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's my first time in this library. I've been in this building before, so it's quite nice. Last time I was walking around, you asked me, "Why are you snooping?" Like, that seems to be a cool library here. So now I'm here. So hello everyone. Hello to those following on Zoom. So I am Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay, Bodhi. I am PI of CoFutures, which is, so what's the distinction here? So CoFutures is kind of like an umbrella now for many different projects. So CoFutures has an ERC project called CoFutures, Pathways to Possible Presence. It has an NFR Free Pro project called Science Fictionality, which is also under this. Then there are Marie Curie projects under this. There are other artistic research projects under this, 4 artistic research projects under this. In all, the team is, the core team is kind of like 12 people, and with various members scattered around the world, right? So most of my evenings, for instance, are spent in meetings because so many of my colleagues are in the US. But so what I'm going to try and do in the next few minutes is very briefly give an idea of what CoFutures is about and what it's trying to do, and then open up for questions. So whatever those are. I'm also a Trekkie. So what is CoFutures? So CoFutures is really it is connected to, in many ways, to science fiction, which is why I pointed to the Star Trek badge. But in a way, it's also a movement further away from it, or quite far away from it in many ways. Actually, CoFutures begins in some of the breaks that we can observe in the 21st century between science fiction and what's happening in the rest of the world in regards to the future and in regards to futurisms, right? So for the last 20 years, especially for the last 10, what we can notice around the world is there a lot of these new movements. They are transmedial. Some of those are artistic movements. Some of those are in literature. So you have a lot of fiction, you have a lot of artwork, you have a lot of music, you have fashion, you have a whole bunch of video games, a whole bunch of different ways of looking at the future, which are being created by various communities, especially marginalized communities around the world, right? So you have a bunch of these. There's, for instance, Afrofuturism, which a lot of you will recognize because Afrofuturism kind of like boom, mainstream with Black Panther, but it's actually quite a lot older than that. So there's Afrofuturism, there's African futurism, there's Indigenous Futurism, which is with indigenous people from around the world, primarily in the US and Canada, North America, but it has also spread worldwide to South America, to here in Norway, for instance. There's Sami Futurism. So there's a whole bunch of indigenous futurisms around the world. So it's futurisms in plural. There's also Middle Eastern futurisms, and there's a lot of like, discussion as to whether the term Middle East should even be used, whether it should be Arab futurism. There's Turkish futurism. There's a whole bunch of those futurisms as well. Then there are South Asian futurisms. We can't call them Indo-futurisms because it's not just India. So there's Desi futurism, which is another term. So if whatever you want to use. So there's a whole bunch of those that are coming up. Then there is China, of course, which in many ways is not quite aligned to, which has in many ways, the same kinds of ambitions as Anglophone SF. So those of you who have seen Wandering Earth, for instance, on Netflix will know what I'm talking about. Like, it's China's big Hollywood movie, right? So on the one hand, there is that, but there is also this very conscious effort to say that we are not Anglophone. We are not trying to do the same thing that has always been done, right? So these futurisms, which have kind of like, they have emerged and exploded really in the last decade. So CoFutures is a project that looks at these. So CoFutures is it's focused on the contemporary. I have a background in history of science fiction really, and history of medicine and how that connects. But what I'm working on and what the team is working on really is the present, last 20 years, but very specifically last 10. Right, and we are doing this transmedially, which is why I mentioned that we have all these other projects as well, arts projects and so on and so forth. So we also have a games research lab at the university. It's the first game research lab at the University of Oslo, really, because we also look at games, right? Because a lot of indigenous futurist expression, for instance, or Afrofuturist expression is coming through video games, right? So we're looking at video games as well. Yeah, so why are we looking at these? So that's the more interesting question, right? And also what makes these futurisms different from the standard kind of Anglophone futurisms that we have seen, or Anglo-American futurisms that we have seen for a very long time. There are several reasons for looking at them. A very simple reason, a very basic reason that is often brought up is we are not sharing in the white imaginary, right? So global South imaginaries, a resistance to the white imaginary, right? White Anglophone imaginary of traditional science fiction. But that's a very simple answer. That's not quite all there is to this. So there is an ethnic component to a lot of this, but that's not the most interesting point. What's most interesting to me, and in many ways to what the team is trying to explore, is how are these futurisms, giving us a different way of understanding the future, right? Which we also, we had a talk on theory from the margins, right? So theory from the margins is actually one of the projects that CoFutures also supports. And next year, we're going to have a conference called Futures from the Margins, the SFRA conference in 2022. So what are these futures from the margins? So one of the big differences here between these new futurisms and what has been happening is quite simply a resistance to the idea of a closed future, right? So to give an example, I mentioned climate change in the description. To give an example, like if you think about climate change, if you think about what the shit show that happened recently at COP26, if you look at the idea of future from the perspective of climate change and what's going to happen in the next 15, 20, 50, 30, whatever time span you use, right? If you have that kind of a vision, this is a temporal vision, right? It's very, very simply a question about time. It's a question about scenario building. How do you go from X to Y? If we do this, then not this, and so on, right? It's a very elaborate set of calculations which are meant to govern the future, right? That's the basic logic of this, right? And if you try and think about this, you'll also notice that climate discussions are generally a lot about trauma. It's about the fact that you really can't do anything. No matter, you can keep recycling, your trash. You can keep separating in blue and green bags, but the future is still doomed. You can start, like that's kind of the basic model, right? That no matter what you do, right, you have certain kinds of individual action that you can take, which will only delay the inevitable, which is doom, right? So this is the discourse of climate change and climate chaos and climate catastrophe. So if we are looking at climate fiction, let's say, which is another subgenre of science fiction, if one wants to call it a subgenre, then climate fiction, primarily in the Anglophone world, a lot of it is really about doom, right? So you have a lot of post-apocalypses and things like that, it's kind of the mess that you will end up with climate disasters, right? But as my friend and Indian science fiction writer Samit Basu says, dystopias are boring where dystopia is just Tuesday, right? So so if you look at futures from the margins, if you look at what's happening in these futures or futurisms from around the world, you will notice that they are not really about doom and gloom. I mean, of course, there's catastrophe, but that's Tuesday, right? So what you get is a different way of thinking, about resilience, a different way of thinking also about technology and innovation, but I don't have time to go into that. But it definitely offers you a different model for resilience, right? And for instance, to talk about indigenous futurists, one of the big challenges that they have is that this kind of a linear model of time doesn't hold, right? So a lot of indigenous philosophers and indigenous people believe in a very different construct of time. It's not a linear sense of time. The past and the future and the present are basically the same time, right? You exist in all these different times simultaneously, right? And this also is a challenge to the idea of linearity that you find, for instance, in climate discourse, right? In any kind of historical discourse. So how much time do I have? Do I have 5 minutes?
You have 2. 3.
I have 2. Okay, 3. then I think it will. I'll end with an example, really. So again, to think of the temporal idea, right? How things move forward in time and so on and so forth. So when you look at apocalypses from the larger Anglophone world, it's like it's like something that's in the future, right? If you look at indigenous philosophers, for instance, Nick Estes, who was actually invited to one of the Theory from the Margins sessions. Now, Nick Estes has this fantastic book, Our History is the Future, and it's talking about the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, right? And that is a climate change related protest that has happened in the last few years. It's actually very burning as an issue right now, even now. Unfortunately so. But that book is called Our History is the Future. And what it does is that it looks at models of indigenous resistance that have happened throughout history to different forms of extraction politics, right? To different forms of necropolitics, to different forms of, extractivism, oil, adventurism, and so on, that has happened throughout the history of America, right? And it doesn't say that, this is the future. It says our history is the future. So in order to find a way of thinking about this, you go back in time, really. You go back to thinking about different kinds of resistance, the resistance that has always been embedded in indigenous thinking, right? And this is the kind of, alternative temporal thinking that you find in Afrofuturism. There is, for instance, a movement within, which is kind of a breakaway movement called, not a breakaway movement, but one of the many movements called Black Quantum Futurism. And it is very much a futurist movement, but it is also talking about time from a quantum perspective. There are many different things to unpack there. One of them is that time doesn't exist. The other is that, the way you would construct time linearly doesn't actually follow if you just look at physics. So, so there's a challenge also within futurist discourse, because mainstream futurist discourse also does very much this kind of scenario building. Oh, if this, then that, if this, then that. So it challenges this kind of if this, then that. Actually, it gives you a different way of talking about the present as it does about the future. And in doing so, maybe gives us hope. So that's what we do at CoFutures. We are looking for hope. We have a lot of hope and we're looking for more. So thank you.
Thank you.